Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Tonight we're going to have complete coverage of a huge election night in last night's midterms. But first, we have pushed that down in the rundown because the Attorney General Jeff Sessions has been fired. Just a day after Dems won control of the House, he has been shown the door. The president, a vocal critic of his. Let's get the very latest on this with Maggie Rulli, who joins us now.
The man replacing Sessions has already said he's a skeptic of the special counsel's investigation and that Robert Mueller's overstepping his boundaries. At the request of the president, Jeff Sessions is stepping down as Attorney General. The president confirming his resignation on Twitter, saying he was pleased to announce his replacement. Sessions, once the president's earliest and most dedicated supporter in Congress, had a rocky tenure as AG.
I am disappointed in the Attorney General. He should not have recused himself.
The president often openly criticizing him after Sessions recused himself from all matters related to the investigation into Russian election meddling and possible collusion by the Trump campaign.
Therefore, I have recused myself,
allowing special counsel Robert Mueller to take over the investigation.
Any attorney general, whether this one or another one, should not be able to interfere with the Mueller investigation in any way.
With his future uncertain, Sessions departed with a simple statement saying he was honored to serve. And with Sessions out, oversight of the special counsel's investigation has been taken away from Rod Rosenstein and is now in the hands of the new acting Attorney General, Matthew Whitaker. In New York, Maggie Rulli, ABC News. Back to you.
All right, Maggie, thank you very much. Now, among the questions, what does this mean here for the Mueller probe? Joining us now to discuss that and more, former federal prosecutor Roland Riopel. And Roland, I want to get to all of the potential consequences of this, and I don't want to pretend like in any way I'm a Jeff Sessions defender. I think he's consciously, both as a senator and even in his job as AG, tried to roll back a lot of protections for a lot of vulnerable populations in this country. That said, the idea that the day after the midterms, the president, without even the decency of calling the man, has Kelly do his dirty work. Then when Sessions says, all right, can I have till the end of the week when I'm being canned? He said, no, you need to leave your office today. And again, the president, without even the courtesy of a phone call, we saw the scene about him being walked out of the office. And you can see it's a divided DOJ right now. I know this is standard operating procedure when someone usually resigns or leaves to move on. They're greeted with tears and heart. But you can see there's a palpable frustration there. And it should be noted, Mr. Whitaker, who we'll talk about, was nowhere to be seen with this. This is bizarre.
Yeah, it's very, very troubling here, Richard. I think that Trump acted so quickly because he's probably watching Richard French every day, and he's heard us talk about the fact that we think something is going to come out very quickly from Mr. Mueller following the midterm elections. And Trump wanted to get into place immediately Mr. Whitaker, who is a Trump partisan and will may choke off the Mueller probe or fire Mueller himself. Remember, Mueller will make his report to Whitaker, and it'll be up to Whitaker to decide whether to send it to Congress or make it public.
Okay, explain.
So this was clearly a political move by Trump.
If you can, Roland, explain both to me and the audience the distinction between a temporary AG, because obviously Whitaker, forget that he hasn't been confirmed, he's not going to be, in all likelihood, the future full-time AG. So talk about what a temporary person who never was fully confirmed by the Senate, what he can or cannot do in that position.
Well, and you know, Richard, before we even get there, there's a whole issue as to whether Trump can even appoint Whitaker under what's called the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998. Under that act, when someone like the Attorney General resigns, the president has the power to appoint a person in his place who has previously been confirmed by the Senate. Now, Mr. Whitaker, because of his position, has been confirmed by the Senate. So if the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998 applies, he can appoint Mr. Whitaker to the Attorney General post on a temporary basis, 210 days, perhaps a little longer depending on the Senate schedule. And then Mr. Whitaker acts with all the powers of the Attorney General. Now, in this case, because there's an argument that Mr. Sessions was fired and didn't resign, if he's fired, the Federal Vacancies Reform Act doesn't apply, and Mr. Trump doesn't have the power to appoint Mr. Whitaker. But Mr. Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, did write a letter of resignation, and I think Mr. Trump and his side would rely on that to say, no, I can appoint Mr. Whitaker. Now, potentially you could have a lawsuit between Rod Rosenstein saying, no, the Department of Justice regulations require that the Deputy Attorney General, me, Rosenstein, I ascend to the level of Attorney General now. That's what the DOJ regulations provide. Because Sessions was fired, I'm the Attorney General. You could potentially have a litigation here now between Rosenstein and Whitaker over who is in fact the Attorney General under the law of the United States. I don't think that will happen, but that's a possibility here.
Okay, so you're Bob Mueller now, and you've been one step, if not 5 steps ahead of everybody else in this. You're the only guy who's kept quiet. You've consistently surprised people by both who've become cooperating witnesses, indictments you've secured, et cetera. Has Mueller been preparing for this probable, forget about possible outcome? We knew Sessions was going to be gone at some point. We just didn't know when. Could there even be indictments under seal? Walk me through where potentially Mueller is right now in lieu of the change of today.
I think Mr. Mueller, who has impressed us all with how much foresight he has, I think Mr. Mueller and the very bright and able people who are working with him have been preparing for a scenario like this for some time. They may have indictments under seal. We just don't know. They may be prepared to release a report immediately. We just don't know. But I think in terms of preserving the evidence and making sure that they've done everything they can do to make sure that the investigation reaches fruition, I've got to believe there's all kinds of things Mr. Mueller may have and his team may have done to prepare for this day. It did come more quickly than I think any of us expected, but I think there's preparation for it.
Does conflict of interest matter here in that Whitaker on CNN, he said that he viewed Mueller's probe here as a witch hunt. He's spoken in other terms about that, the four corners are far more limited than they believe maybe the Mueller folks have gone into. They shouldn't look in the Trump finances, et cetera. Clearly, this is a guy who is on the record as in the bag for the president. Does that in any way, is there any kind of regs that say, well, you're obviously compromised, you're going to have to recuse yourself to be running this probe?
Again, there's no clear regulation on that. There is the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998, which pretty much allows the president to appoint anyone to the Attorney General's position. Now, if Mr. Mueller or Mr. Rosenstein believe that there is a conflict of interest that would prevent Mr. Whitaker from properly supervising the Mueller probe, it's in theory possible that there could be litigation over whether he can supervise it or ought to be removed in deference to Mr. Rosenstein. It'd be wild, but and I just don't see it happening, but it's a possibility.
Obviously, the election of last night changes things. Specifically, the House now will have subpoena power, and Democrats obviously in charge.
Not till January, though.
Not till January.
Not till January.
But my point is, this thing cannot be just shoved into a desk in perpetuity. At some point, somebody's going to have to answer some questions. This won't go all the way by itself. Give me where you believe, and I know this is so subject to conjecture, but could pardons start being passed out like Uno cards here by the president to protect primarily his kids, son-in-law, etc.? What do you think happens between now and January? Because obviously people are going to have some questions.
That's a possibility. You see, if there are indictments under seal or indictments contemplated in the near term, Trump, particularly as to family members, I think may consider granting pardons right away to somebody like Donald Jr. or Jared Kushner, in the hope that that heads off the public disclosure of any indictment now under seal or any possible indictment which might be coming down the pike quickly. That's a possibility here. Roger Stone, I think it'd be tougher for Trump to do that and get away with it, but that's another possibility. He may start issuing pardons because he knows at this point he's never going to be removed from office with the majority Republican Senate he now has. So I think he'll be emboldened in terms of the actions he'll take. And the actions he took today are one example of that.
And I just want to remind people, we talked about this for months, if not the better part of a year. Every time Mitch McConnell was pressured as to why not to even allow a floor vote on legislation that would protect the Mueller probe, he dismissed it out of hand because he said the possibility of shutting down the probe is beyond the pale. We don't need to have this legislation. I just want him to remember the day after the midterms where we are right now and how so many of us saw this potentially coming. But Roland, I am sure we may not even be able to stay away from each other for a full week, given how fast these developments are unfolding. But thank you as always for the time, my friend. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I'm always available, Richard.
Yeah.
Pleasure to be with you.
You almost said it's a pleasure, but it's not. But it's a pleasure talking to you. Okay, coming up next. We thought we'd lead with this, and that was really a historic election night last night. We'll have a full recap. We'll talk about the local races, and there was major surprises there. We'll talk about the balance of power, which definitely changed, and also where we go from here. Andrew and Dominic will join me on the other side of the break.